Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you're new. I hope you're having a wonderful day as always. So in today's video, we are going to be filling out form I-864, the affidavit of support form for the joint sponsor. You may have been asked to help support an intending immigrant in the situation when the primary petitioner or the primary sponsor doesn't make enough income. One of the first things that I want to point out is, as a joint sponsor, you should not be the only one filling out form I-864. The primary petitioner must be also filling out form I-864, a separate I-864, even if they don't make enough income. Another thing you may have noticed is that this form is expired as of September 30th, 2021. This is fine. What they recommend is to just keep using whatever forms are available on their website. Okay, so let's get started. We can leave these top two sections alone. These are not for us, and this is where we will start the application. In the first part right here, the basis for filing affidavit of support, this is where you as the joint sponsor will type in your name. And next, you're going to have to select who you are as the person filling out this affidavit of support. And obviously, as a joint sponsor, you would want to select 1D. If you know that there are two different joint sponsors, this option right here, 1E, will only apply in situations where the petitioner who is trying to immigrate their relatives is helping immigrate a very large family, for example, and they require help of two separate independent joint sponsors to sponsor different family members. So this is the only time you would select whether or not you are a first or second of two joint sponsors. But generally speaking, option 1D is the most frequent option. So after this, you're going to move on to section 2. Please be aware that section 2 is asking about the principal immigrant. It is not asking for your information as a joint sponsor. In this example, we have a petitioner who is helping his sister immigrate to the United States, and his sister will be bringing her spouse and son with her as the sibling of the primary petitioner. Mary Smith, in this case, is the principal immigrant because she is a relative of a U.S. citizen, for example. Just double check that you are writing the information of the principal immigrant. Moving on, make sure that the mailing address is also indicated for the principal immigrant, as well as right here their information about their citizenship, date of birth, A number, USCIS account number, and phone number. These two, A number and USCIS account number, if the intending immigrant doesn't have them, that is totally fine. You can leave these blank. Moving on to part 3. Here, you're going to have to answer the information about the immigrants that you are sponsoring in general. So as a joint sponsor, most likely you will have to select this. Question 1, I am sponsoring the principal immigrant named in part 2. So yes, we have to select this. You will answer no only if you are the second of two joint sponsors sponsoring derivative immigrants. I wouldn't even worry about this part because for the most part, very frequently you will only have to select this. And then if you are aware of any other derivative applicants that are immigrating with the primary immigrant, you will also then have to select either question 2 or 3. So this will apply in our case where Mary is the sibling of a U.S. citizen who is the primary immigrant, principal immigrant. However, Mary also has a spouse and a child, and because the petitioner cannot directly petition for his brother-in-law and his nephew, for example, they are going to have to be the derivative applicants on Mary's application. And so for this very reason, you will also have to include them in this section right here. And if they are immigrating at the same time or within 6 months of the principal immigrant, this question 2 is the one that you will have to select. If the derivative applicants are coming to the United States after 6 months of the principal immigrant, then you will have to select question 3. But again, this happens in rare situations. And if you are still confused about who is the principal and who's the derivative applicant, I do have a video explaining this in detail. Like I said, the derivatives will have to be included in this section, section 3. So we here included Mary's spouse and also later on her child. Moving on, question 29 in part 3 will be answered automatically for you if you're using Adobe Acrobat application on your computer. It will calculate it for you automatically, but basically you will have to sum up the number of immigrants included total in this affidavit. So right here it says including the principal immigrant listed in part 2 and any immigrants listed in part 3. So moving on to part 4, here is finally asking about you, the sponsor. So as the joint sponsor, here you will have to fill out your information. So your name, your address, and then right here, as you can see in question 3, it's asking, is your current mailing address the same as your physical address? If you have selected yes to this question, then over here, you can leave this area completely blank, because this address is the same. If your mailing address and physical address are different, then obviously you have to select no and indicate your physical address here. Moving on. So this information is very important. So make sure that you answer what your country of domicile is, your date of birth, any other information that they're asking for in this section. Moving on, if you have an A number, USCIS account number, you can include these here, but if you don't, that is totally fine. If you are a US citizen by birth, you most likely will not have these. Moving on to part 5. So here you will have to calculate household size. So before I move on, I want to make a couple notes. First, I have a video specifically dedicated to calculating household size. Make sure that you watch that video if you have any additional questions after this. Obviously, refer to the form instructions as well. And finally, people will frequently have a problem with calculating household size. For a lot of people, there's a glitch that will not update these numbers for them. So please make sure that you are using the actual Adobe Acrobat Reader application or program on your computer instead of editing this in an internet browser, because it will not work that way. So make sure that you're downloading these forms to your computers and filling them out this way. As for the household size, here under number 1, obviously it is asking you to provide the number of immigrants you're sponsoring in this affidavit. Next, you will have to obviously include yourself, and as a joint sponsor, obviously you'll have to also include if you're married, your spouse, if you have children, your children, any other dependents you have. So this means specifically dependents that you have listed on your tax returns. Number 6 is asking if you have sponsored any other persons in affidavit of support form before who are now green card holders. So if you have filled out a form I-864 for somebody else, but they are not yet lawful permanent residents, you don't have to include them here. Number 7 is asking if you have any household members, such as siblings, parents, or adult children with the same principal residence, who will be combining their income with yours. This is optional. For question 8, it will calculate the total household size for you. In our case, our joint sponsor is married and also has 2 dependent children, so as well as they will be taking on the 3 immigrants, 1 principal immigrant and 2 derivatives in this case. So this is how you would calculate the household size. As a joint sponsor, you do not have to include the petitioner, so the person who is submitting all of the immigration paperwork for their relative. You don't have to include them. However, all the intending immigrants will be listed on the household size. Moving on to part 6. Here it is asking about your employment and income. So if you are currently employed, obviously select box number 1 and then indicate your position and where you work. If you have 2 jobs, obviously you can include 2 jobs. And if you have 3 jobs or whatever it is, if you have any additional information you want to provide, you can use the additional information page at the very end of this application. If you are self-employed, you can select box number 4 and indicate your occupation. If you are retired or unemployed, similarly, obviously you can include this here. So part 6, question 7 is a part where a lot of people frequently have questions, and that is including your current individual annual income. So in my I-864 playlist, I do explain specifically these parts about reporting income on the affidavit of support, but for the purposes of this video, you need to remember that this is asking for current, meaning in the year during which you are submitting this affidavit of support. So right now we are in the year 2021. So in this year, between January 1st and December 31st, 2021, how much money you are projected to make. And also it is asking about individual income, meaning that you will only be including your own income. A lot of people frequently ask, what if I file taxes jointly with my spouse, etc., etc. So this does not ask for tax return information. This is asking about current individual income. So this is basically an estimate of your income this year. You can obtain this estimate either by calculating it yourself or speaking with your human resources or speaking with your employer to provide you some kind of information about how much money you make a year. And it is recommended that whatever amounts you indicate here, that you provide evidence for it as well. So like I said, you can provide a letter from HR, letter from your employer stating your annual income. You can provide recent pay stubs as well. Okay, so moving on to the next section. Income you're using from any other person who was counted in your household size. So anybody counted over here, if they are able to use their income with yours, you would want to include them. So any person in your household who is going to add their income to yours in order to sponsor will have to be included here. So the household members is basically a relative, such as a sibling, parent, adult child, or spouse of the sponsor who is residing with the sponsor in the same residence. In our case, the joint sponsor will be using income of their spouse to support the intending immigrants. So here under person 1, we wrote the joint sponsor's spouse and her current income. The way we calculated it is the same way we calculated it for the joint sponsor over here. Moving on. So in this next page, part 6, question 20, it is asking us to include the total annual household income. And in the Adobe program, it will calculate it for you, including anybody's income that you have indicated in the previous parts. Moving on. So a lot of people tend to skip these two questions, and it's important that you read them very carefully. So question 21 is asking if any of the people in the previous part that we have indicated, any household members that we have mentioned, will be completing form I-864A. You may be wondering, what is this form? Well, I-864A is another affidavit of support contract between the sponsor and their household member. So all of this is legal documents, legal contracts. Anybody in your household who will be adding their income to support immigrants will also have to agree in writing that their income will be used to sponsor the intending immigrants. In our case, our joint sponsor, his spouse, will be pulling her income in. So in this case, his spouse will have to fill out form I-864A. So question 22 doesn't really apply in a lot of situations for joint sponsors, simply because, so this question 22 will only apply in situations when the intending immigrant who has no accompanying dependents will be using their own income to also help themselves, either help the joint sponsor or help the primary petitioner. And in that case, the intending immigrant doesn't need to fill out form I-864A. In our situation, this doesn't apply, so we're going to leave this blank. Moving on. So this part is asking about federal income tax return information. So for question 23A, obviously answer if you have filled out tax returns for the most recent 3 tax years. If you have not filled out for every of the 3 years, you can select no and then also use the additional information page to explain why. So for example, if in the year 2020 you filed your taxes and then 2019 you did, but then in 2018 you were a student or you didn't make enough income, you didn't have to file for whatever reason, then you can select no, obviously, and then explain on the additional information page. So next, right here, it is saying that you must attach a photocopy or transcript of your federal income tax return for only the most recent tax year. So even if you have filed income tax returns for the past 3 years, you only are required to attach a photocopy of your federal income tax returns for the most recent year, which is 2020 right now. However, right here, 23B is also saying that you can attach photocopies or transcript of federal income tax returns for the second and third most recent tax years. This is optional and you don't have to select this if you don't want to. Moving on. So right here, it is asking for the total income as reported on federal income tax returns. So in questions 24A through 24C, you will have to include the years of the most recent 3 tax years and then the income as listed on those tax returns. And it is asking for the total income. So when you're looking on your taxes in the total income line, you will have to see what the amount was listed and you will have to write it in the way that it is. So this is another point where a lot of people have questions. So in our situation, our joint sponsor files taxes with their spouse jointly. When it comes to any sponsors who are filing jointly with their spouses, aside from IRS transcripts or copies of your own federal tax returns from your own records, in the case when the sponsor or the joint sponsor does file their taxes jointly with their spouse, but is only qualifying to use their own income for the affidavit of support, they will need to provide either a copy of IRS transcripts or their own federal income tax returns. Will also need to be supplemented with copies of all W-2s and 1099s, because the total income line on your tax returns will obviously be higher than the amount you're indicating in this affidavit of support as your personal income. So, and if you still have questions about this, you can definitely check out my I-864 playlist. I have a video in there specifically clarifying this married filing jointly situation. So, and then finally, question 25, you will select if you were not required to file a federal income tax return because your income was below the IRS level and you have attached evidence of this. So as a joint sponsor, you obviously wouldn't have a reason to select this because as a joint sponsor, you will have to have money to sponsor intending immigrants. However, this will most likely be selected by the petitioner if they're not making enough income, if they weren't required to file taxes, if they're unemployed, whatever it is. Okay, and moving on to part 7, this is asking about assets to supplement income. So the form instructions say that you should only be including assets if your income doesn't meet the income requirements based on the federal poverty guideline. So in this case, you can use your assets such as your savings and checking accounts, any real estate value of stocks, bonds, any other value of any other assets that you have. These can be used to supplement income, and there is a specific calculation that you can make in regards to that, and you can see that in the form instructions. However, in our case, the current annual household income for the joint sponsor is way more than enough to support the incoming immigrants. And in this case, we are not going to disclose any information about these assets. When it comes to the assets of the principal sponsored immigrant also, this doesn't need to be included, especially if the income amount meets the requirement. So moving on, to part 7 right here, questions 9 and 10. If you have not indicated any assets, obviously these will be left blank. Part 8 is the sponsor's contract, signature, certification, everything. So please make sure that you read this very carefully. This will explain about the affidavit of support, why you're required to sign it, your obligations as the person signing this affidavit of support, any legal consequences, and also it will talk about when your obligations as a joint sponsor or as a regular sponsor will end. Next, you will have to select one of these, either that you can read and understand English, or if you required help of an interpreter to read the questions and instructions to you, you can select this. And then question 2, if somebody else prepared this form for you, you obviously will need to select this. Then indicate your contact information here, and don't forget to sign right here on the next page and date. And the final couple of sections are asking about the interpreter if you used one, as well as a preparer if you've used one. Obviously, if you didn't, like we didn't in our case, we can just leave this completely blank. And finally, the additional information page is the very last page of the application, and this is the page I was talking about if you have any additional information you would want to include. So this final part, I want to briefly mention some of the supporting documentation that you should be providing with your application. So first of all, you will need to provide proof of your residency or citizenship in the United States. So you will need to provide either a copy of your US passport, US birth certificate, or a copy of your green card, for example. Next, you will, like I was talking about here, need to provide proof of your current income, such as, like I previously mentioned, a letter from HR, employer, or pay stubs. This is optional, but it is highly recommended. And finally, you will need to obviously provide proof of your income taxes. So you can either use an IRS transcript that you can order on the IRS website that will be mailed to you, or a copy of your own records and copies of W-2s and 1099s. If, like in our situation, a household member filled out Form I-864A, that is another form you would need to include. Your household member will also need to include the same proof of residency or citizenship, proof of their income, proof of their taxes, which in our case, their spouse is submitting same tax returns, so we don't need to duplicate them. And finally, the household member will also need to provide their proof of relationship to the sponsor. So in our case, the joint sponsor's spouse, they will need to provide a copy of their marriage certificate as well. So I hope that you found this video useful. Please check out the playlist that I have on my channel about this form. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I hope to see you in my next videos.